The Artemis estate breathed only through the rhythmic hum of its cooling systems, a machine-like silence that masked the rot within its foundation. On a night when the London mist clung to the limestone, the grand vault stood open, an impossible anomaly that defied the high-security protocols of the family. Inside, the air was still heavy with the scent of ozone and something colder, something final. A single heirloom lay discarded on the polished marble floor, its surface catching the thin, pale spill of moonlight from the high transom windows. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a surgical extraction of a legacy. The digital locks had not been forced. They had been invited to surrender. As I look back at the wreckage of that evening, the contradiction was clear. The security logs recorded a system failure that never occurred, while the physical evidence suggested an intruder who possessed the keys to the kingdom. Someone had choreographed this collapse with the precision of a master architect, leaving behind a trail that pointed toward a motive far more complex than mere greed. Welcome to Swasti Diaries, where we dissect the fractures in human history. The Artemis family vanished from the public eye not because of a sudden tragedy, but because of a sequence of events that began long before the first alarm failed to sound. The question remained: if the vault was open from the inside, who was the hand that held the master code while the world slept? The investigation into that night revealed a truth that was, in many ways, more damaging than the crime itself. The vault door stood as a silent witness to a betrayal that transcended mere theft. It was not the locks that failed, but the bloodline itself. Grace Bernard understood the architecture of the Artemis estate better than anyone, for she spent years mapping the hidden fractures of her own heritage. The heirloom left behind on the marble floor was not a mistake. It was a signature, a deliberate insult to a legacy that had discarded her mother decades ago. Looking back at the evidence, the path of the perpetrator was marked by a chilling, calculated efficiency. Every movement within the estate walls seemed rehearsed, a sequence of events designed to strip away the family members one by one, like pages torn from a ledger. Simon Artemis, the patriarch, likely believed he held the strings of this puppet show, orchestrating his own brand of survival by thinning the herd. He did not realize that he was merely a component in his daughter's design, a man whose greed blinded him to the blade poised at his own throat. The estate, once a fortress of privilege, had become a mausoleum of secrets. As the investigation unfolded, the question shifted from who entered the vault to why the security protocols were dismantled from within. The cold reality was that the destruction of the Artemis family was not an intrusion. It was an internal collapse, carefully curated by a daughter who refused to be forgotten. The silence of the house that night was not the absence of sound, but the sound of an empire coming undone. The library floor remained cold, the polished marble reflecting the dim, amber glow of the wall sconces. It was here that the first casualty of the Artemis collapse was discovered. To the casual observer, the scene presented a tragic, singular accident. A slip, a fall, a life extinguished in the quiet hours of the night. The medical examiner's initial report leaned heavily into this narrative of misfortune, citing a blunt force impact consistent with a tumble from the library's mezzanine ladder. But as the investigation deepened, the logic of the room began to fracture. The victim lay perfectly parallel to the mahogany bookshelves, his limbs composed in a way that defied the chaotic physics of a sudden fall. There was no sign of a struggle, no scattered books, no disturbed dust. Only the sterile, haunting order of a staged event. I looked at the placement of the victim's silver pocket watch, which had skidded across the floor, coming to rest precisely 3 inches from the baseboard. It felt like a deliberate punctuation mark in a sentence that had not yet been written. Even more unsettling was the state of the library's service door. While the main entrance remained locked from the inside, the heavy brass bolt of the side exit showed microscopic abrasions, suggesting it had been manipulated with a custom-fitted bypass tool. The estate's security logs, however, insisted the door had never been opened. This was the first true contradiction, a physical breach that the digital record refused to acknowledge. If the system was perfect, then the ghost that walked through that door must have been someone who held the master key to the house's electronic soul. The library floor remained cold, the polished marble reflecting the dim, amber glow of the wall sconces. It was here that the first casualty of the Artemis collapse was discovered. To the casual observer, the scene presented a tragic singular accident. A slip, a fall, a life extinguished in the quiet hours of the night. The medical examiner's initial report leaned heavily into this narrative of misfortune, citing a blunt force impact consistent with a tumble from the library's mezzanine ladder. But as the investigation deepened, the logic of the room began to fracture. The victim lay perfectly parallel to the mahogany bookshelves, his limbs composed in a way that defied the chaotic physics of a sudden fall. There was no sign of a struggle, no scattered books, no disturbed dust. Only the sterile, haunting order of a staged event. I looked at the placement of the victim's silver pocket watch, which had skidded across the floor, coming to rest precisely 3 inches from the baseboard. It felt like a deliberate punctuation mark in a sentence that had not yet been written. Even more unsettling was the state of the library's service door. While the main entrance remained locked from the inside, the heavy brass bolt of the side exit showed microscopic abrasions, suggesting it had been manipulated with a custom-fitted bypass tool. The estate's security logs, however, insisted the door had never been opened. This was the first true contradiction, a physical breach that the digital record refused to acknowledge. If the system was perfect, then the ghost that walked through that door must have been someone who held the master key to the house's electronic soul. If the digital security logs were beyond reproach, then the physical world had lied. Looking back at the evidence, the true anomaly was not the side door, but the silver heirloom itself. This was no mere trinket discarded in a moment of panic. When the forensic team traced its origin, they uncovered a startling fact. The heirloom contained a concealed microchip, a digital key designed to override the estate's encrypted perimeter protocols. It was a bridge between the physical and the virtual. The victim had not been a passive target. He was in the final stages of a plan to expose the entire Artemis fortune, intending to dismantle the very foundation that sustained his own bloodline. He had meticulously documented the family's illicit financial dealings, intending to upload the data to a remote server just hours before he met his end. The discovery of this digital trail changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. It proved that the murder was not a crime of passion, but a surgical removal, a calculated effort to silence a threat before the truth could surface. Yet, as I analyzed the timeline, a new contradiction emerged. The override sequence initiated by the heirloom was timestamped at 2:14 a.m., precisely 3 minutes after the security logs recorded the victim's final, fatal tumble. If the victim was already dead, who triggered the digital purge? The answer lay hidden in the one place the investigators had overlooked: the study's ventilation shaft, where the air still carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone. The discovery within the ventilation shaft shifted the investigation from a singular act of violence to a wider, more systemic betrayal. My analysis of the estate's inner circle revealed that every member possessed both motive and opportunity, yet none of them stood alone in their ambition. Simon Artemis, the patriarch, had operated under the guise of grieving, but the financial logs suggested a different reality. A man desperate to liquidate his own legacy to escape impending bankruptcy. He had not merely been a victim of circumstance. He had been the architect of his own family's surveillance, installing the very security protocols that were later bypassed. The digital security logs provided the skeletal structure of the crime, but the testimonies from the household staff provided the flesh. Each account contained subtle, irreconcilable contradictions. One maid claimed the library door was locked from the inside at midnight, while the security system recorded a bypass sequence originating from the study's own terminal at 1:45 a.m. If the patriarch held the master codes, why were they utilized by a secondary, low-level user credential? The trail led directly to the digital security logs, which showed that the credentials belonged to a legacy account, one that had been inactive for over a decade. It was the account of the illegitimate heir, Grace Bernard. Her sudden return to the estate had been dismissed as a familial reconciliation, but the forensic evidence suggested a calculated infiltration. As I cross-referenced the server timestamps with the physical movements within the house, a chilling pattern emerged. The security system was not broken. It was invited to fail. The question remained, did the daughter act entirely on her own, or was she the blade in her father's hand? Looking back, the elegance of Grace Bernard's deception began to fray exactly when the digital logs were reconciled with the physical timeline. Grace claimed she spent the entire night of the incident in the West Wing library, cataloging rare manuscripts by the glow of the desk lamp. She maintained this narrative with a chilling, calm precision during every interview. However, the estate's secondary security logs told a vastly different story. At 2:12 a.m., the motion sensors in the East Wing gallery triggered, yet the library's internal terminal recorded a simultaneous command input from her authorized credentials. It was physically impossible for her to be in two places at once. This was not a mere oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to create a digital ghost. I scrutinized the server timestamps again, searching for a bypass but found none. The credentials were used legitimately from the terminal. If she was not the one pressing the keys, then who had access to her private login? The implication was unsettling. Someone had either stolen her identity or, more likely, she had orchestrated the entire sequence to provide herself with an airtight, albeit logically impossible, alibi. The air in the house grew heavy with the weight of this contradiction. Simon Artemis watched the investigation from the periphery, his silence acting as a dam holding back a flood of secrets. Every time I pressed him on the discrepancies, he deflected with rehearsed grief, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine panic. The narrative was collapsing, and the true architect was beginning to lose control of the very machinery they had set in motion. The digital logs were not just data, they were a map of a betrayal. I pulled the secondary server logs from the utility room, bypassing the main terminal that Grace had so carefully manipulated. The truth emerged in a series of time-stamped file transfers that bypassed the library entirely. At 2:12 a.m., while Grace sat in the West Wing, a ghost connection originated from the gardener's cottage, routing through the estate's main server to override the East Wing gallery locks. It was not Grace who entered the gallery. It was someone who knew her login, someone who had been given the keys to the digital kingdom. I returned to the vault document, my hands trembling slightly as I re-examined the signature page. The ink on the secondary witness line, the one I had previously dismissed as a smudge, was a faint, deliberate impression of Simon Artemis's own signet ring. He had not just allowed the security breach, he had engineered the digital trail to frame his own daughter, expecting her to be the fall girl for a crime they had ostensibly planned together. The realization shifted the entire foundation of the investigation. Grace was not the sole architect of this tragedy. She was a pawn in a much darker game of inheritance. But as I looked at the timestamps again, a new detail caught my eye. A secondary login, active 5 minutes after the first, originating from inside the master bedroom. Simon was not just an accomplice. He was still inside the house, waiting for the final act to conclude. The hunter had become the hunted, and the night was far from over. The digital trail was only the surface of a much deeper, colder wound. My investigation shifted away from the cold logic of the server room and into the dusty archives of the Artemis family history. I uncovered the circumstances surrounding the death of Grace's mother, a woman erased from the family records years before the current tragedy began. It was not a simple accident as the official reports claimed. The records, buried deep in the estate's secondary vault, revealed a systematic dismantling of her mother's financial autonomy, orchestrated by Simon himself. Grace had not acted out of a sudden, erratic impulse or a simple desire for wealth. She had spent years cataloging her father's cruelties, waiting for the moment he felt most secure. Every lock she bypassed, every security protocol she dismantled, served a singular dark purpose: to strip Simon of his legacy while he watched it collapse under the weight of his own arrogance. He believed he was the conductor of this symphony of destruction, thinning the family herd to consolidate his own power, unaware that he was being methodically lured into his own trap. Grace was not just an heir. She was the architect of his eventual ruin. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She had never intended to escape the estate. She intended to make it his tomb. As I stared at the ledger detailing the final, illegal transfer of assets from her mother's account, I realized the final piece of the puzzle was missing. If Simon was still in the house, he was not hiding from the police. He was waiting to confront the ghost of his own past. The police investigation reached a point of absolute certainty late that Tuesday night. The detectives were convinced they had solved the Artemis mystery. They focused their entire case on a disgruntled former security contractor, Elias Thorne, who had been fired by Simon just weeks before the first death. The evidence seemed to fit perfectly. Thorne's keycard had been used to access the estate's secondary server room, and his digital footprint was scattered across the logs of the mansion's internal network. For the investigators, this was the end of the road. They prepared to close the file, satisfied that a vengeful employee had orchestrated the systematic elimination of the family to punish the patriarch for his arrogance. I spent those hours reviewing the interrogation transcripts, watching the recordings of Thorne's desperate, frantic denials. He looked like a broken man, but his story held together under the most grueling pressure. Then came the revelation that shattered the entire theory. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the forensic team recovered a secondary, hidden security log from a private router buried in the estate's attic. It proved that Thorne's keycard had been physically cloned and used by someone already inside the house at the time of the first murder. Worse, the software signature used to overwrite the logs was not the work of an outsider. It was a proprietary script written by Simon Artemis himself. The disgruntled employee was a convenient scapegoat, but he was never the architect. The investigation had been chasing a ghost, while the true conspirators remained inside the walls. The discovery at 3:14 a.m. changed the trajectory of the entire case. While the investigators had been fixated on the external threat of Elias Thorne, the hidden router in the attic told a different story. It was not a breach from the outside. The software signature used to overwrite the security logs was a bespoke, proprietary script. It was written by Simon Artemis himself. The realization hit like a physical blow. The patriarch had not been protecting his estate. He had been actively dismantling its defenses to facilitate the elimination of his own blood. I traced the digital breadcrumbs further into the network logs. There, tucked away in a subdirectory of the main server, was a sequence of commands that mirrored the exact timing of every security failure. It led directly to a discarded laptop that Grace had claimed was stolen weeks earlier. The device had not been stolen at all. It had been the central console for the entire operation. Grace had used her father's own code to bypass the secondary locks, while Simon provided the administrative credentials to ensure no alarms triggered. The father believed he was thinning the family herd to secure his inheritance, unaware that his daughter was merely using his arrogance as a shield for her own endgame. She had allowed him to think they were partners, all while meticulously cataloging his complicity to ensure his eventual ruin. The laptop, once recovered from the depths of the estate's waste management locker, was the final piece of the puzzle. It contained the complete history of their pact, a digital confession that left no room for doubt. The investigation was no longer about a disgruntled employee. It was about a cold, calculated betrayal between the two people at the top of the hierarchy. Looking back at the reconstruction, the timeline unfolded with a terrifying mechanical precision. We mapped the movements of that night, hour by hour, and the pattern emerged from the chaos. Grace Bernard had orchestrated a symphony of silence. She did not merely bypass the security, she manipulated the entire logic of the Artemis estate to serve her design. The digital logs were the key. We saw the exact moment the secondary locks were deactivated, not by an intruder, but by a command sequence originating from the master study. Simon Artemis had provided the administrative credentials, believing his daughter was securing the perimeter to protect their shared secret. He was the architect of his own destruction. While he focused on the external threat, Grace was already inside the system, rerouting the surveillance feeds to create a blind spot in the West Wing. The physical evidence corroborated the digital footprint. We found the scuff marks on the floorboards leading away from the service entrance, matching the exact path Grace took to access the server racks. It was not a violent breach, but a quiet, calculated infiltration. She moved through the house like a shadow, knowing every shift in the floorboards and every creak in the rafters. The most chilling realization was the timing. Every murder was synchronized with a false alarm she triggered from the laptop, drawing the security detail to the opposite side of the estate. She left Simon to believe they were partners in a cold, necessary purge of their own kin. She played the dutiful heir, all while planting the evidence that would eventually lead us straight to her father's doorstep. The plan was flawless, right up until the point she left behind the one thing she could not erase: the digital breadcrumbs of her own betrayal. The case against Grace Bernard seemed complete, a closed loop of cold ambition and mechanical precision. Yet, as we combed through the remnants of the Artemis estate for the final time, a single contradiction stalled the entire investigation. Tucked deep within the lining of the library's wall-mounted vault, we discovered a document that shattered our understanding of the hierarchy. It was not merely a log of security overrides or a list of assets. It was a signed, witnessed agreement dated 3 weeks before the first death. The signatures were clear. One belonged to Grace, but the other, the one that rendered the entire lone wolf theory impossible, belonged to Simon Artemis. The patriarch had not been a victim of his daughter's digital warfare. He had been an active, willing participant, providing the administrative backdoors and the precise timing of the security patrols to ensure the house remained a tomb for his kin. He believed he was thinning the herd to preserve the estate's liquidity, a partner in a grim, calculated purge. Grace had played him as thoroughly as she had played the security system. She allowed him to think they were allies, letting him shoulder the burden of the logistical planning while she prepared the final turn of the blade. The document revealed the true depth of the betrayal. Simon was the architect of the environment, but Grace was the sole executioner of the intent. She had trapped him in his own conspiracy, leaving us to wonder, did Simon realize his daughter was the final name on her own hit list before the end arrived? The silence of the Artemis estate at 3 a.m. felt heavier than usual, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Looking back, the pieces of the puzzle fit with a terrifying mechanical precision. Grace Bernard was never merely a vengeful daughter striking out in isolation. She was a predator who understood that a house divided against itself would inevitably fall. The document we recovered from the vault, the signed pact, was the smoking gun that rewrote the history of that night. Simon Artemis, the patriarch who built this empire, had been the one to feed his daughter the security keys. He believed in his arrogance that he was thinning the family herd to consolidate his own wealth, acting as a silent partner in the systematic elimination of his own relatives. He viewed the deaths as necessary subtractions from a ledger, unaware that Grace had already calculated his own removal as the final step in her equation. She led him through the process, letting him believe he was the mastermind of the purge, while she manipulated the digital overrides to ensure every trail led back to an internal security failure she controlled. The betrayal was absolute. Simon had paved the way for his own demise, convinced he was a survivor in a game he had already lost. As we traced the path from the vault to the study, the evidence of his complicity was undeniable, yet the cold reality remained. He was a willing architect of his own destruction, a man who traded his family for a fortune he would never live to spend. Grace had not just outplayed her father. She had turned his own greed into the very weapon that ensured his silence. The final question remained, did he see the blade coming, or did he die believing he was still the one in control? The Artemis estate stood as a hollow monument to a greed that consumed its own architects. As the final forensic teams retreated into the pre-dawn shadows, the house remained, holding the echoes of a family erased by the very hands that should have protected it. Grace Bernard had not merely committed murder. She had dismantled a dynasty with the surgical precision of a ghost, leaving behind a legacy of shattered glass and cold, empty rooms. The signed pact in the vault proved that Simon Artemis was the architect of his own downfall, a man who believed he could play God with his own kin until the blade turned against him. He died in the realization that his daughter was the one predator he could never outrun. Looking back, the crime was never about the fortune. It was about the absolute, devastating reclamation of a life stolen by blood ties. The digital logs, the overridden locks, and the discarded hardware became the final artifacts of a war fought in silence. The case closed, but the weight of those choices lingered in the stagnant air of the study. The cycle of vengeance was complete, leaving behind nothing but questions about the nature of legacy and the price of silence. History would remember the Artemis name, but only as a cautionary tale of how quickly a house built on secrets can be leveled from within. Thank you for walking through this dark chapter with me. If you appreciate this deep dive into the shadows of the past, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries.